Hot stove conversations about baseball, history, football, and current events that may leave you saying there's more to consider. Now, here's your host, Jack Moore.
Welcome to another edition of More to Consider. On More to Consider, I have discussed my background. I'm a sports fan, I'm a lawyer, a lot of history background, etc. One thing in my history background that has fascinated me for as long as I can remember just growing up is, what is America's role in the world? How did we get here? And today I have on with me Scott Horton. Scott Horton is, in the circles that I run in, he's a hero to a lot of people because he is libertarian in thought, libertarian in view. And he's the type of person that I run with often that really gets into the function of government. Why do we do what we do? Why does everything seem to be catch as catch can? We keep, I think if Michael Malice said, no matter who you vote for, you end up getting John McCain. Seems like the wars are never ending. Let me get a little bit of background here on Scott. Scott is the director of the Libertarian Institute. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com. He's a radio guy. He's the host of Anti-War Radio out of Los Angeles, California. And he does a podcast on Scott Horton, on scotthorton.org. He does the Scott Horton Show. He's the author of Fool's Errand, and recently, many books here, The Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, 2017, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, 2021, the editor of The Great Ron Paul, which we just discussed, what a great American man he is, a hero to many on this side of the political aisle. The Scott Horton Show, interviews 2004 to 2019, and he's recently written, and I went out and got my copy of Provoked, and that title is How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott, pleasure to have you on. How are you today, sir?
Thank you very much. I'm doing fine. Appreciate you having me.
All right, so before we went on, I kind of want to go through this with you. I wrote a master's thesis on the Kennedy assassination, and I noticed a lot of looks at post-World War II. They'll tend to go back to Eisenhower's 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration. He gives the famous speech where he talks about the military-industrial complex. I understand that he wanted to throw Congress under the bus, but his handler was like, whoa, Ike, you can only go so far. But he talked about the spiritual aspect, how we had become, what we had become following World War II, this sort of knee-jerk policeman of the world and where this was going. He's an interesting cat. He's a colonel on his way out of the Army pretty much when the war begins. He's a 5-star general by the time it ends. He's supreme commander of NATO forces at one point. He's supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He's a man of a lot of power and a West Point graduate. But I don't know, a lot of what I see in that history makes me think that he might have been a little bit concerned with the direction the country was going. So here's my setup for you. Washington gives a farewell address. And we famously heard that he kind of says, beware the entangling alliances. So we go from that point through an American Civil War. There is a Mexican-American War, but it's not until 1898 that we really get into this involvement somewhat overseas into other parts of the world. We're drawn into World War I, rightfully or wrongfully, we go there. Many people think it upsets the balance, as you know. But we get to World War II, and in the end of World War II, this race to Berlin, once we get to that position, we are in Europe. Europe's blown up. Japan's destroyed. And as you've said in your books and you've said in many interviews, we have that opportunity on the ground to influence the peace in Germany, where Germany's going, and clearly Japan. Then NATO, then in opposition to that, the Warsaw Pact. Then that's the world I grew up in, the Cold War. That's what I know growing up. And I'm taught as a school kid, we're the good guys. And we have to be in control of the world, not us. Then it's left to the bad forces. Then, as you talk about in your book, Provoked, and a lot of other works of yours, with 1991 and the end of the Soviet Union, we get into what is the purpose of NATO still? Was this a great victory? So what I want to know from you and all of your study is, who are these people that continue to create war after war after war? Is it over money? Is it ideology? Are these people true believers in something? This is what I've never been quite sure to understand. Is it just clearly they're nefarious people? Again, they're making money off of things that go boom. They're the people that work in all these military industries, or is it more? What do you think it is with these people?
Look, as always, it's a conspiracy of interests and ideas and all of these things. So there's a famous profile in the New York Times from the mid 1990s, I guess, about Bruce Jackson, who was an executive vice president at Lockheed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another great article about him called Lockheed Stock and Two Smoking Barrels by Richard Cummings. That was originally written for Playboy.com, but you can find it on my website, scotthorton.org/fair use. And you'll be able to find the reprint of that thing there. He talks a lot about Bruce Jackson. And I'm pretty sure, I forget what the Times article says, but it's in Richard Cummings' article. He explains that if you hear Bruce Jackson tell it, he really believes in this stuff.
Right.
Right? Bruce Jackson, that's why he works at Lockheed, is for the same reasons that he works with the neoconservatives to promote their think tanks and their agenda, is because he is a true believer that George Washington didn't know what he was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have this world empire, and this is how you do it. So now the guy's an executive vice president at Lockheed. Y'all heard me. Like, what are we talking about here? Clearly he has an interest in all of this. But then again, that makes sense. Then that's why he got that job. Maybe that's why he wanted that job, but that's why they gave him that job, was because, man, this guy's going to be great for business. Everywhere he goes, he talks about the beneficence of American military power. And you know who likes hearing that? The Pentagon. Hey, Pentagon, we can help you wage your wars better. Listen to me. That's what they want to hear. You have big ticket items for us to purchase? Hell yeah. So it's a captive market. It's the perfect, dichotomy, the way they work. And in fact, in that article, Cummings talks about how Lockheed had made, I always forget the name of the plane, forgive me, but it was a domestic airliner that was supposed to compete with the 737 and the DC-9 or the DC-10, I guess. But it was a piece of crap, and Delta only bought a few of them, and there was just no demand for the thing. And that was it. It all fell away. And they had just spent billions of dollars developing this aircraft. And so they held a big meeting where they decided, forget that, dude. We're not competing in the market anymore. We are only making military equipment for the Pentagon from now on and associated allied states. And then, so they said, okay, that was step one. A few years later, they held another big meeting where they said, what would be really helpful would be if we help determine what American foreign policy is going to be, so that we know what kind of military equipment to make. Right. So that, because even with a captive market, if we make a bunch of desert gear and they're going back to the jungle or vice versa,
right,
then we're still wasting money, right? So let's us set the policy so that we know what kind of weapons to make. What we need now are weapons for Eastern European states for NATO expansion, and weapons for American forces in the Middle East to fight in the desert for hegemony there, and this kind of deal. And so, for that matter, build up the Navy in the Pacific in the name of China. And then they put, as Andrew Coburn said, the neoconservative movement is really best understood as the cross between the Israel lobby and the military industrial complex. So you could think of it like this, where, and this is oversimplification, but there's truth in it too, right? That the Council on Foreign Relations belonged to the old WASP families, and particularly the Morgans and then the Rockefellers, right? And these were what they used to call the old liberal Eastern establishment. And they represented, well, what I just say, Morgan and Rockefeller. This is banking and oil, right? And the Rockefellers immediately got into banking. The Chase Manhattan Bank and Citibank were their banks dating back 100 years ago, right? What's now known as Citigroup and JP Morgan Chase. These were the Rockefellers' banks. These were the people, it was really a Morgan project at first, and then the Rockefellers ended up dominant by the end of World War II, and it was their guys who ran the Council on Foreign Relations ever since then. So oil and banking have the CFR and the permanent foreign policy establishment. But the new right, if you watch like the movie JFK, the way Oliver Stone tells the story, it's the beast. He's not talking about the Eastern establishment. He's talking about the new right that grew up after World War II, the military industrial complex in Texas and Colorado and California and Washington State. These guys are right wingers. They're cold warriors. They don't want détente with the Soviet Union. They want at least containment or even rollback, because that's in their interest to do that. And that's why the new military industrial complex and their associated groups were more hawkish than the Eastern establishment, who were more likely to favor détente and that kind of thing. So they made their alliance with the neocons, who were always more hawks. And then just real quick to finish up here.
Yeah.
Then they created the Washington Institute for first of all, they took over AEI and Heritage.
Right.
That's first and foremost. But then they created the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Committee on the Free World, the Center for Security Policy, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, right? They created this whole forest. You have the CFR. Well, we have 17 CFRs, and they're all backed by Lockheed and Northrop Grumman. And this is where, because if you think about it, right, the guys that run these firms, they need eggheads to write their studies to justify their business. They're not eggheads, they're businessmen. So then they turn to the neocons and they go, you're all a bunch of college boys, write me some studies. Here's some money.
Yeah.
And so this is, the Yankee Cowboy War, as the historian Carl Oglesby called it, right? And that's how that dynamic works. And that's what we're still dealing with now. And they're all kind of intermarried, and it's generations later. But this is the form of the empire in America, is, as we're talking about, right? Vested interests supporting ideological ones in order to get their way.
Something that really struck me is at the beginning of JFK was the Eisenhower farewell address. I mean, Oliver Stone literally opens with that. And there is the line where Eisenhower said, we used to go from plowshares to swords and converted the factories back. No longer. Now we're just going to make the swords. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with Eugene Jarecki's Why We Fight.
Yes.
That was an eye-opener for me, because he opened with the exact same thing. He opens with Eisenhower. And in that, he shows some of these like conventions where these military industrial complex types, or the manufacturers of the things that go boom, are having like these religious revivals. And they're talking about how much they love the soldiers and the troops. And there's, 4 stars hanging around, and they're eating finger food and having cocktails. And you're like, if this is, this is 20 years ago, and it's an eye opener to me, because it's just right after 9/11. As a matter of fact, part of Jarecki's documentary is going to a gentleman that had lost a son in the World Trade Center. And they approach him with, you want us to write a slogan on one of our bombs we drop as we go into Iraq, and whatever the relation here is. But then he started to see it kind of unravel. So this poor guy is like, they sort of use my son. They use the emotion of my son's death against me. And there's a CIA guy that spent 10 years. And he said, and I know you've heard these figures, he said, we now have 700 some odd military installations in 110 countries. And you're like, oh, really? Like at the time, I'm like, it's early 2000s. And he talked about the term blowback, and I mentioned my admiration for Dave Smith as right before we go into the crazy. I have this really close friend that's very libertarian like I am. He's like, you got to listen to this Dave Smith guy. And Dave Smith's talking about Ron Paul. He's talking about Ron Paul handing Giuliani his ass about blowback. He's talking about these things. And I was always a fan of Ron Paul, because it's just a gentleman. He made sense. And I remember him and Alan Keyes both were 2 guys in 2008 that I liked. I really liked both of them. And I know that they were speaking on a level that I don't think most people could really hear. And I've heard it said now that Dr. Paul, God bless him, is 90 years of age. What he sowed maybe 20 years ago is starting to find root. I do believe a lot of people are coming around to, hey, maybe that guy was right about some things. So I say all that to say, based on what you just said, it does sound like this intermingling of financial interest and ideology. In other words, if you have a financial interest, you can find somebody with the right ideology to write whatever you want or support it. So it just keeps feeding itself. All right. So we go back to the founding. I want to kind of go back there again. Hamilton, Jefferson, the agrarian dream of Jefferson versus we got to have the moneyed interest and all. It's been the same fight since the beginning. And if anybody thinks, and when you look at the political cartoons of the time, the editorials, it was nastier than it's ever been. So there's always been this fight about what America's role will be. Now in 1790, with 3,000 miles of ocean and the differences as far as movement of potential troops and things like that, it was a different world. We now are in this post 20th century world where a missile can reach somewhere in minutes. So we have that tension. I have a good friend of mine, and he's a war veteran, Vietnam, and we've had these discussions. I always thought he was very libertarian, but as time has moved on, he more and more sides with the military industrial complex. There's no question. And I asked him one day, I said, buddy, how did you get to this point? And he said, if it's Russia, if it's China, it's the U.S. I want the U.S. to run the world. And if we step So I want to ask you that. I mean, and I love this guy. He's a patriot, right? He served in Vietnam. And but again, he's Ayn Rand fan. He taught me a lot about being a libertarian.
There's an easy answer to this, man.
Talk to me.
Which is that America is the most prosperous society on the planet, and we cannot afford it. So ipso facto,
right?
Russia cannot afford it either.
Mm-hmm.
And China cannot afford it either. China also, unlike the United States and Russia, is a net resource importer, right? They make finished goods out of trees and natural gas and oil and things that come from far away places, right? Is what they make stuff out of. And so they're entirely dependent on the rest of the world. So you could say, oh, there's their motive for creating a world empire. There's also their motive for actually playing it cool and just trading with people.
Mm-hmm.
They want to build this Belt and Road initiative across Central Asia. We can't do a Belt and Road if you're at war with all of Islam, right?
Right.
And so and the same thing for the history of China in the Pacific going back centuries, eons, is that they're surrounded by all of these island nations, and they don't have the ability to conquer them all or even break out past these island chains. Or what are they going to do? They're going to come and forcefully dominate South America or something like that. I mean, these things are just not in the cards at all. If China is aggressive, they're going to take back Taiwan, which 50 years ago, Richard Nixon told Mao, yeah, no, Taiwan belongs to you. I don't want you to attack them, though. I hope that you guys will work this out peacefully. And he refused to promise to go to war for Taiwan because it's not a sovereign nation. And it would be ridiculous. I mean, look at a map. And I've seen this on TV. Show us Taiwan, and people point at China. Yeah, okay. You have no idea what you're talking about, okay? Taiwan is this teeny, tiny, insignificant little island 90 miles off of China's coast. And it's none of our damn business, and it's far, far beyond our ability to influence. We helped convince the Chinese to abandon Marxism and adopt property rights and prices and markets. So guess what? They've made $1 billion since then, and they can now afford a navy powerful enough to keep us away, not to dominate the 4 oceans and the 7 seas, but powerful enough to keep America where we only control 99% of the Pacific instead of all 100% of it. So tough. That doesn't mean they're coming for Tokyo and for Seoul and for Canberra. You know what I mean? They're not coming to attack all of our allies in the Pacific. And, Russia is a far weakened rump of what the Soviet Empire was. And despite all of the hype and propaganda, they have no ambition whatsoever to dominate Eastern Europe, much less the world. They have no ability to do that whatsoever. They they have a lot of resources, but they have about half our population and nothing like the sophisticated and incredibly complex American capitalist economy to bring those resources to bear out, to their full economic capacity. And Russia itself is a huge overextended empire with plenty of its own internal problems. The idea that Putin would even consider in a daydream on a PCP trip that he could dominate the planet. I mean,
right.
Look, Russia is the northern part of Eurasia, so I'll give you that. You know what I mean? That it is, unlike the bin Laden's caliphate, it actually does exist, the Russian Federation. But the idea that it's an expansionist and revolutionary power like the old Soviet Union, and one that we need to be afraid of, or the one that Warsaw or Berlin need to be afraid of, is preposterous. All right. And even from, and look, they're the much weaker power, but even from the Chinese point of view, as ruthless as Chairman Xi may be in his internal politics and whatever, is there really anyone who thinks that this man is fool enough to look at George W. Bush and Barack Obama and say, that's me. That's what I want to do, is I want to blow my country's brains out. I want to destroy everything that we've built so far by trying to take over the whole damn planet somehow. No, man. See, your friend, and you can tell your friend this. Hey, man, you're actually just repeating some bullshit that you heard somebody else say before. Stop and think about what you're saying. That China and or Russia could dominate the planet Earth? No, they could not either. And if you ask your other neurons, they already know that. So put down the slogan and think this through. It's nonsense.
All right, let me ask you this one too. This is what I've been dying to ask you. I've been thinking about it since we got you booked on the show. So I watched things for years, and I got years on you, so I'm older than you. So again, I grow up. I actually told a graduate when I was in graduate school. I told a professor. I said, when I was about 13 years old, I started thinking, like, I wonder what war I'm going to get sent to. And she's like, oh my gosh, that's fascinating. You thought that? And I'm like, yeah, my dad got drafted during Korea. 6 of his uncles were in World War II. On my mother's side, 6 great uncles were in World War II. My father's brother, 20 years younger, got drafted during Vietnam and served in Vietnam. I'm like, hell, everybody. It was like, which war, as it rolls through time, are you going to end up in? So I'm watching political leaders through the years, and my feeling was in the late 60s with the campus unrest and alike, in the Jane Fonda incident and things like that, I thought there seemed to be so much, especially like the Hollywood left, as it's coined. They were so into all of the Soviet or communist bloc countries. Maybe they're getting it more right than we are. And I think back to like the Bernie Sanders, what he and the wife went to the Soviet Union for their, right? So I'm listening to all those lefties back during that time, the college professors, the ones that were going to Berkeley and all these different, universities, or all the Ivy League schools. Mm-hmm. And then you fast forward and Putin's Hitler. And it's like, it's an attack on the Russian people in general. And I want to know from your standpoint, what is the switch? Because a lot of these people that are now in political office or have political influence, they weren't, they hated Reagan, but they certainly, I didn't think didn't hate the Soviet Union in 1988. They kind of leaned that direction. So what flipped? Where did this flip come from all of these prominent people in political positions now hating Putin, hating Russia? Go.
Well, look, the simple explanation is it's all their fault and they cannot accept responsibility for any of it. So they project all of the responsibility onto the other side of the thing. And again, and I'm speaking now to your right-wing friend who fears China ruling the world and whatever. Like, I'm not coming from the left at all, like to that point of view. You look at, now I forgot what I was going to say.
Why did all the lefties end up hating Russia? And how did Putin become Hitler?
I'm not sure how I lost my train of thought there. Yeah. But anyway, I'll just say this instead of whatever it was. That, Putin clearly was, I know what it was. I was blaming the liberals for screwing everything up, right?
Right.
Especially, and W. Bush too. They really caused this problem, but it was especially the consequences of Obama's foreign policy in 2014 in supporting the Maidan revolution and, then launching the civil wars. John Brennan, the same guy that framed Donald Trump for treason with Russia and the same guy who backed al-Qaeda in Syria, the head of the CIA under Obama, was the same guy who started the war in Ukraine. And so that's why if you ever hear these people tell the story, it always begins, well, if not in 22, it begins when Russia took Crimea in March of 2014. But they always skip what happened in January and February when America overthrew the government there, which was why the Russians took back the Crimean Peninsula. So John Mearsheimer says that, this is really the core of the narrative against Putin. Doesn't really start until then. And it's just an alibi for the fact that they had provoked this fight. If you listen to the leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland on the phone with Jeffrey Pyatt, where they're planning the transition and who they want to come to power, they're saying, we got to glue it. We got to midwife it. We got to stick it. We got to make it sail before Putin can torpedo it, right? So it's all about, we got to pull this thing off before the Russians can do anything about it, right? It's the same thing that Gideon Rose, who was the editor of Foreign Affairs, the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, he said this to the old Stephen Colbert character on the old Colbert show, that's what we got to do, is we've got to get away with this while Putin is distracted with the Sochi Olympics so that he can't do anything about it, right? We're real slick and we're real smart and we know what we're doing, right? Except I guess they get the Comedy Channel in Moscow. So somebody told Putin, hey, man, they're calling you stupid. And so then he went and he took the Crimean Peninsula.
Right.
And so then they go, oh, man, that guy, he's just like Adolf Hitler marching into Czechoslovakia, because they can't just say what it was that they had to do with any of this. So they have to start the narrative there, and they have to assign all of his motivations to being evil and aggression, right? And a will to power rather than a reaction to anything stupid they've done. And which is funny because, as I show in the book, the actual players involved, including Barack Obama himself and including John Brennan himself and all of these guys at various candid times admitted that, look, he didn't have a plan to expand into Eastern Europe. The seizure of Crimea was a reaction to what we had done. As Obama said, the transition of power that we had helped to broker in Kiev. This was his reaction to that. A very polite way of saying that his covert forces had overthrown the government there and causing Russia to react this way. So the other part of it is, of course, that Putin's a right-winger. Putin's a conservative. He's not, and by a right-winger, I just mean he's on the right. He's not a right-winger like what that actually means, like some kind of far-right ethno-nationalist or any kind of thing like that. In fact, what he is he's a very center-right conservative Republican Christian. Now, it's true that he's a strong man and has been in power for 20 years, right? I'm not saying he's just as much of a Republican as H.W. Bush or whatever, for whatever that's worth.
Right.
But he's not a fascist. He's not a far right-wing crazy reactionary, and he's not a communist, despite his previous stint in the KGB. He was a clerk, a colonel in the office at the KGB. He was not a spy, a recruiter of spies, or anything like that. He was holding down the fort in East Germany at the time, basically. And very importantly, during the communist hardline coup of August 1991, he sided with Gorbachev and the reformers against the communists who were trying to save the Soviet Union, which, of course, ended up leading to its final overthrow by Boris Yeltsin and the gang in the next couple of months after that. And so he's not a communist, and he's not some kind of crazy swastika waving lunatic either. He is essentially a center-right conservative Christian. And so we'll rewind and talk about Russiagate more in a second, but
yeah,
just on one level, when Trump was there and then gone again, and Biden came in, Putin became the stand-in for Trump, right? And he was supposed to be what they all hated and feared about Trump in the first place, was that Trump wasn't elected because he's Americana, because he's the Golden Arches and Michael Jackson and a can of Coca-Cola Classic. Donald freaking Trump we're talking about here. No. He was a foreign spy Manchurian candidate who, was sicked on us by the Russians, who usurped Hillary's rightful throne in this coup d'etat and installed him in power and all that. So, and he's a right-wing horrible fascist who's going to round up all the trans boys and shoot them in the head or whatever crap that all these Democrats convince themselves to believe. And so then when he was gone, well, now who are they going to demagogue against and be all upset about? And so they just transferred whatever hate they already had on Putin that was kind of divided between Trump and Putin, all went to Putin, right? Where he is like the avatar of what the dad they all resent for leaving them when they were a kid and leaving them to be raised by their idiot Democrat mom who filled their heads with this crap, whatever their, psychological problems are that make them react in this way. And that was part of it. And then see, if you go back to the anti-establishment era of the new left after Vietnam and Watergate and all that. I mean, as you said, I'm younger than you, but I just turned 49. So I was born right after Vietnam and I was raised during that whole era where, hippies hate the government and the FBI is COINTELPRO. That's what the FBI means, right? They're the ones who murdered Martin Luther King, for God's sake, right? The national government in Public Enemy, right? They say the federal government is the #1 killer and destroyer of black leaders, right? That's wisdom from the left. The national government is your enemy, right? They're the ones who destroyed the Panthers. They're the ones who destroyed like everything good that the left, and I mean, left of the Democrats had going on at that time. And they're the ones who sent everybody's brother to get killed in Vietnam. They're the ones who did, the corruption in the White House so bad that the president actually didn't even fight it. He resigned rather than fight the charges in the Senate because he knew they had his ass. And like, that was the old sentiment of the liberal Democrats, and it lasted into the W. Bush era. They protested against the first Iraq war to a limited degree, but they really protested against the second Iraq war. And I was there, and I marched with the left in February 15th and March 15th of 2003 here in Austin, Texas, against that war. And I couldn't believe where did all these people come from, man. I'm from this town, and I had no idea there were that many politically active leftists who were willing to come out for that thing. There must have been 75,000 people, at least 50,000 people out there protesting during that time. And there were a lot of people from the earlier generation who were anti-Vietnam War, veterans for peace types were out there, helping to lead it. And they were sort of the last gasp of that sort of sentiment on the left for that time. Because then what happened was the Democrats exploited Cindy Sheehan and the protest at Camp Casey against the Iraq War in 2005 and into 2006 in order for the Democrats to take back the Congress in 2006. And what's the first thing Nancy Pelosi did? Was finance the escalation of the Iraq War, the so-called surge of 2007, and all that completely betrayed everyone. But what did? They shut up about it because we're trying to replace the Bush Republicans with the Democrats here, right? So whatever Nancy Pelosi's doing is better than whatever the Republicans would do. So they don't want to hear it. And then Barack Obama comes, and he is in their daydreams, right, in their imagination, he's a hair to the left of Hillary Clinton, who after all was an unapologetic supporter of the second Iraq War and refused to say that, yeah, I really did make a bad judgment call on that. She kept standing by it. And Barack Obama comes, and he was on the record opposing the war and saying we shouldn't do it. And then, but also he's tall, dark, and handsome and has a nice smile and all this stuff. And his name is Barack Obama, and he's a Democrat. He's from Illinois. And so he is, in the mind's eye, he is the mirror, like just not mirror, but the total opposite of W. Bush in every way that's important for people to rally around. And so then when he said things like, well, of course, we're going to escalate the war in Afghanistan, they went, huh? And then, and pretended not to pay attention. And when he escalated the war, they didn't care. He escalated the war to appease John McCain and Lindsey Graham, and he calculated that it won't cost him the love of the left. And he was right. It didn't. Right? Because they weren't going to sacrifice him over Afghanistan. Forget it. They don't care about people over there getting blown up. It's too far away. And so that was, where they really started their major compromise. And then Obama, he attacked Afghanistan, escalated obviously hugely in Afghanistan, spread the war into Pakistan, into Yemen, where he fought against al-Qaeda before switching sides and fighting a war for them, a war of genocide against the entire population of the country in the name of trying to fight the Houthis there. He took al-Qaeda's side in Libya and leading to the total destruction of that state, which is now in three pieces, at low level war with each other, and including the re-legalization of chattel slavery of Black Africans there, which persisted to this day, by the way, now that it's 14 years later. That's not just a news story from 2011. That's still going on over there because of Barack Obama, the first Black president. And then he supported the jihadists in Syria, leading to the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, the same one that was the ridiculous propaganda of W. Bush and Glenn Beck just a few years before. Obama built it for them and gave them all of Western Iraq before launching Iraq War III to destroy it again.
All right,
and
so
if you're going to be a Democrat during that, you have to make peace with the devil. You have to say, no, I am not. That legacy of the new left of Vietnam is not part of my identity anymore. We're all war hawks now. And then let me add one more thing here, and I'll wrap it up. Is then when Donald Trump comes to town, the CIA and the FBI and the Democrats, in that order, framed him for treason with Russia, and claimed that he was this Manchurian candidate and that there had been a coup d'etat and all of this. And so now in that entire narrative, where Donald Trump is a racist, fascist, white supremacist, totalitarian who has been installed in power by not just a foreign nation, but the greatest enemy of all, the Kremlin and Moscow, Russia, has done this to us. And then who are the antibodies? Who are the heroes fighting this foreign infection? The CIA and the FBI, the secret police. They are here to make sure that the elected president of the United States does not get to exercise the authority that he won in a free and fair election. And instead, they are going to, as the FBI told CNN, if we can't overthrow him through the 25th Amendment, at least we can rein him in by launching this special counsel investigation and pretending to investigate him for another 2 years. That was after the first year of this crap. They went for another 2 years with the explicit purpose of preventing him from being able to exercise his authority as a reminder, the actual only elected person in the entire national government's executive branch, the chief executive over all of them. And his own government was at war with him the whole time. And to the liberal Democrats of America, all these idiot feminists listening to National Public Radio on their way home from work every day, this is the greatest true crime drama ever for them to be all engrossed in. It was the kind of conspiracy theory crap that you usually find among the fringes pushed, well, and from the center, but this was a huge one from the center, was here are 1,000 claims. If they're all true, just imagine the picture that it paints. But the thing is, you just have to believe hard because none of it is true. Right. And so you have Trump Tower this and Trump Tower that, and you have Flynn and you have Sessions and you have Page and you have Papadopoulos and you have the Alpha Bank and you have all of these things, the hack of the DNC. None of it is true. Zero. And for anyone in your audience who thought, wasn't there a kernel of truth to that? No, there was not a kernel of truth to that. It was John Brennan at the CIA framed Donald Trump for the whole thing. That was the kernel of it all.
Okay.
And
I got a question.
That made the CIA and the FBI and the entire national security state the heroes of the American liberal democratic left. Not necessarily the real leftists, but like the Democrat voters of America, the feminists of America they made candles with Robert Mueller, the former George Bush's director of the CIA. And then they prayed to him like he's a Catholic saint.
Okay. Let me ask you this. All right. When I voted for Reagan in 1980 and then really not much of anything after that, because as I got older and I kind of looked at the whole political landscape, I just they're all the same type of thing. So when Trump came down the escalator in 2015 and I was watching sort of the theater of it all, I'm like, I don't know. I remember him with Donahue. I remember him with Larry King. I remember with Oprah talking about maybe running for president, always critical. It wasn't run like a bit, better business. Then I see him eliminate the Republican field. We all saw that. And there is a theory that, Hillary was all for the major media networks to support him because he'd be easier to defeat.
We can prove that.
Right. And then it backfires. And
the Pied Piper strategy. And you can read the email from her Democratic staffers saying, we want the media to promote Trump because he'll be easier to beat in the general.
All right. Now, this happens. And of course, it apparently backfires. She doesn't have any real measure of how much she's really despised in many circles. She doesn't go to Wisconsin, whatever. So she's got a bad political strategy. She doesn't listen to her husband, too. And a lot of people thought if she'd let Bill do all this and not these young guys that didn't really know. All right. So this happens, and immediately the attacks come out on Trump. And I remember, just as Joe Q citizen, not really believing in the media, but not nearly to the degree I will post-COVID. I always knew it was bullshit, but I just didn't realize how much it was bullshit until then. But I'm watching it come down. And I can't believe a lot of the stories I'm hearing. Now I'm hearing that this was more of a thing to cover the sins of Hillary to go on the attack against Trump, more so than it was strategic. But what I do find interesting is Hunter's working for of all places, he's in Ukraine. There is, as vice president, Biden's tremendous amount of influence on the politics of Ukraine. What does Trump get impeached over? The phone call to Ukraine. There's all these things spinning. They're setting him up as this Putin puppet. And I think it leaves in a position clearly that if he tried to work towards better relations with Russia, then, all your alphabet agencies and all your alphabet networks. Well, see, there you go, right there. We knew it. Him and Putin. And, what's interesting, too, was the time that Trump was asked, Putin says he didn't have anything to do with a lot of this stuff. What do you think, Putin or our intelligence agencies? And he's like, I kind of go with Putin here on this. Then it was like, well, that's treason. Now he should be hanged for treason. So I'm watching.
It was Brennan that said that. It was Brennan that called it treasonous for him to say that, when Brennan was the one who made up the whole thing.
Right. And I got to believe at that point, from the inside, Trump knows how much bullshit all this is. Like, he knows what's going on. And he knows Hunter. He knows the background on what's going on with Hunter. So I ask you, where I want to go with this is, which do you think, a chicken or the egg type of thing here, which do you think drove this? The things they had to cover for Hillary, how knee deep she was, how knee deep Biden may have been in some things involving Ukraine. And was all of this done as an attack more on Trump? Or is this probably is an escape hatch, really, because they didn't expect him to win. Now that he's won, were they afraid of what he could come out with, because he now had inner knowledge, because he was inside the circle? He had enough knowledge to show. And what they did, the attack on Trump, was more, was it to protect Hillary, or was it just to neuter Trump? Which is it?
Well, okay, so it was, what it really was, I think it was the second half of the Pied Piper strategy, right? Which is, the first half is, we got to make sure he gets the nomination.
Right.
And the second half is, and if you remember back to that time, you probably noticed at the time too, as soon as it was clear that it's inevitable, he is going to get the nomination, they were even talking about the Republican establishment finding a way to try to thwart him at the convention.
Oh, that's right. Absolutely. Yes.
It was clear that that was not going to happen. And as soon as it was clear that that was not going to happen and he was going to be the nominee, then the media turned on him 180 degrees. They had been promoting him and promoting him and promoting him.
That's right.
Famously, they would show an empty podium with Trump on it.
Yep.
While Bernie Sanders is giving a speech in front of 4,000 people. They're showing an empty podium where Trump is late, but he's supposed to be here soon, and all that. Joe and Mika on MSNBC promoted him constantly until it was clear he's getting the nomination, then immediately 180 degree. And this was their media op. And now, so there's a lot we still don't know about the very, very origins of this. But we do know that John Brennan kicked this thing off at the end of 2015, at the minimum by December of 15. The earliest that we know that the Clinton campaign is in on this is the end of February, beginning of March. And they didn't hire Perkins Coie, the law firm, until, that was behind a bunch of the Steele dossier and a bunch of the other related hoaxes, until April the 1st. So we know now, especially from the new documents coming forward, which I'm still not all the way up to date on. I got a lot of jobs. But we know that it started with the CIA and the FBI and then the Clintons. Now, it could be that Hillary and Brennan had a conversation at the golf club one weekend that we're just never going to know, that kind of origin of it. I don't know that. It seems like very clearly from the time that the Clinton campaign got in on it by March, that they were all phrasing it in terms of, this is to distract from Hillary's email scandal. Now, this is not the hack and the leak to the DNC. That's not until the summer. Right. This is for 30,000 missing deleted emails. And it was a big scandal that she was under investigation. And it was clear because those emails were deleted because they proved her corruption while she's Secretary of State and raking in millions and millions of dollars to the Clinton Foundation. That's right. It's completely compromised by all of this. And now we know more and more, and we're learning more and more about how the Attorney General was leaning on the FBI to wrap this up. And we have now where Jim Comey, remember when he announced, we don't think there's a case here against Hillary and we're dropping our investigation here and we're recommending that DOJ don't go further. We know now that he did that because he was worried that the FBI investigation into the missing Clinton emails was going to lead to the campaign working with the FBI and the CIA to frame Trump for treason with Russia. And he already knew that was going on, and he was worried his agents were going to get on to the story. And so that was why he ended the investigation into her missing emails at that time. And so
Why did he do the thing later though, where a week before the election he goes, hey, on second thought, we got to get back into the Hillary thing.
Okay, so that was because what had happened was if you remember I believe a member of the House of Representatives, Anthony Weiner, who was married to Huma Abedin, who was Hillary Clinton's right-hand man. His laptop, he'd been under investigation for sending unsolicited adult pics to minors, to I believe a 15-year-old girl or even younger maybe. And so he was in trouble for that. And as part of the investigation, the FBI agents in the New York office had found a bunch of classified emails, Hillary Clinton's State Department emails on his computer. Where for whatever reason, he on his laptop, he has his wife's email program on there.
Right.
You know? And so they got the laptop. And so then Comey was worried that the New York office was going to leak, that they had found incriminating things and that Comey was covering it up and was helping Hillary Clinton to win, and that he was worried that that would hurt her. And he instead concluded that if he just went ahead and announced it, that would be the least worst way to go. And he later said, we were making all of these decisions in an atmosphere where we thought it was inevitable that she would win. So in other words, he was going to apologize to her at his first opportunity and explain that, Madam President-elect, I did that only because I thought it was the only way to go, because the New York office was going to screw us both by leaking this if I didn't do the right thing right away. And then, in fact, what he did was he had his people conclude that actually there's nothing on there that's really of interest or that we didn't already know about before the election. So he did try to, he lit that small fire because he had no choice, but then he put it out anyway. But that didn't stop her, of course, from blaming him for her loss.
All right,
which did cost her a couple of points.
Something else when we get into the Trump thing. So again, and I have a tendency to do this, all my audience knows this. I wrote my master's thesis on the Kennedy assassination, and what I find and by the way, I think Oswald did it, but I think he did it for the government. But one of the things I find fascinating, Philip Sheehan from the New York Times wrote a book here a few years ago, Cruel and Shocking Act, and it's about the Warren Commission. And there was an opening. Wagner Carr, who was a Texas Attorney General, calls D.C., gets a hold of J. Lee Rankin, who was chief counsel to the Warren Commission, and says, you got a problem here in Dallas. There's a rumor running around that Oswald was FBI. So they call an emergency meeting. And Earl Warren, bless his heart, who was probably a little naive, he was a politician from California. He'd been governor of California, was a World War I veteran, kind of believed in the system. He sits everyone down. And he goes, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call J. Edgar Hoover, get him over here, put him under oath, ask him some questions about this Oswald thing. And they said, Alan Dulles, who's sitting on the Warren Commission, fired CIA director by JFK, who knows that they're trying to kill Castro with the mob, never mentions that at all during the Warren Commission, like, hey, there might have been blowback. But what's funny in the opening of Sheehan's book is he said, Dulles raises his hand and he looks at Earl Warren. He goes, he's not going to tell you the truth. And Earl Warren is like, I'm sorry, what? If we call J. Edgar Hoover, he goes, if he's a good agency guy, he's going to lie to you. I know I would. Like, he literally says that, like, I know I would. I say all that to say this. That's 1963, former CIA director. And he's there from the start. He's, late 40s. He's right there at the inception of the CIA. So I was watching one of your videos when you're discussing this, the Vindman, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman with his Ukraine background. His testimony in these congressional hearings is very much, I don't know who this son of a bitch Trump thinks he is, but we're the foreign policy. And it reminded me, and I'm trying to remember his name. Remember there was Bowtie guy too, like with the Yale education. I can't remember his name, but he was a CIA type. And I remember the disdain that he testified with. Like, I don't know where this guy comes from, Trump, but we are foreign policy. So something has happened. And again, the reason I bring up the Dulles thing is he very clearly tells the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who has been put in this position, which he should have never been in, where he's the head of this commission. But he's telling him straight up, as a good agency guy, I'll lie to you and anyone else I have to lie to, as I know Hoover will. So we have all these rogue agencies in some sense. I don't think there's any doubt about it. And they have their own agendas, and they will outlast any presidential administration. So we, with our libertarian minds, how do we regain our country from the sense of, I mean, I think the Constitution's a pretty good document when it comes to basically just a very dispassionate structure of the separation of powers and all the other type of things that we would like to believe are in there. But it's only as good as the people that run it. But clearly we're off track. We have a state. When I say state, we have a structure that runs things. And I'm not the big, the big democracy guy. The founding of the country was never to be a direct democracy, clearly. The only aspect of democracy would be you vote for your dumbass farmer friend down the street for the House, and then the state legislatures would send the U.S. senators before the 17th Amendment. So the structure was never one man, one vote. We get to decide how the federal government runs. But it's clearly out of order now, and I don't know how I mean, again, God bless you for your work. You're waking people up to see what's going on. But clearly these agencies are running the government from within. And there's only so much we can do in voting for representation that I think can have some kind of voice. So how do we gain control again as people, if there's some way that you can think of? I mean, how do we gain control?
Yeah. Well, look, I don't have good answers for this. The best answer is just the Ron Paul answer, which is just keep teaching people about liberty and keep telling them the truth about what's going on in the world and build this consensus among the people that, no, we don't believe in that stuff anymore. And that's really what it comes down to. And then other than that, wait around till the dollar breaks. At some point, you can only print so much of these things. And we've seen how this happens throughout history. At some point, confidence in the dollar will break. And at this point, I prefer it sooner than later. If the alternative is our empire is only rolled back by hydrogen bombs in some kind of insane third world war, which is what our government, it's not that they're intent on provoking, but that they, in effect, are intent on provoking, right? Their doctrines of global preeminence don't really allow for even Russian and Chinese independence from our empire. And so it's a pretty bold position to take. And it's one that if they don't eventually back down from, it's going to lead to total catastrophe. So we're at the point where a total economic meltdown in the United States of America might be the best case scenario compared to the other alternative, which is total global murder suicide. And which, if anyone doubts this, I mean, the fact of the matter is America and Russia both have about 1,000 targets in each country. And I don't know about the Russian war plans, but I know the American plans are to hit each of those 1,000 targets a few times each, at least. And even if nobody targeted Europe, even if the Russians didn't target Europe, they would still be, essentially killed off by the radiation, the radioactive fallout clouds and whatever. And all of humanity would suffer from the global cooling of nuclear winter. And the thing is about nuclear winter, you don't have to picture like the deepest Minnesota blizzard in July. That's not the point. The point is it's just enough to block out the sun enough to make your crops fail. And that's enough. I mean, we have to keep the reason there's no famine in the world anymore, other than places where America deliberately inflicts it on people like in Yemen and Palestine. The reason there's no famine is because of capitalism and because of course, all advanced scientific techniques of farming and all that, but also complex methods of distribution of goods and services through these trade channels that we've established. And so you have massive crop failures across the world. I'm sorry, I forgot the business lingo for it, where they talk about like the real-time supply chains. We have like essentially no back stock of anything. Everything has to get to market just on time and whatever for ultimate efficiency and all that. Imagine the total breakdown of all of that from a nuclear war, where the most sophisticated economies in the world, all of the northern hemisphere is essentially destroyed. And the rest of mankind has to grow whatever crops they can and whatever dim sunlight they can and figure out a way to survive that. You're talking about humanity set back thousands of years, all of Western civilization destroyed, everything our ancestors have built over the last 3,000 years, completely obliterated. And then, whoever survives in the global South, completely desperate and starving and hungry and global wars between the survivors over whatever resources are left. Absolute hell on earth beyond imagination, where literally the living would envy the dead. My grandpa used to say, if there's ever a nuclear war, I hope the first one lands right on my head. I don't want to live to see what happens after that. And we're just too far removed from the propaganda of that Cold War era. I'm I'm old enough that I did grow up in the 1980s, and I remember especially the early 1980s and the brinksmanship with the Soviet Union and a real fear of nuclear war among adults that I knew, not just kids who got carried away. But
remember the film The Day After?
Yeah, sure. And of course, this was part of what really changed Ronald Reagan's perspective. Also, his daughter brought an Australian nuclear physicist named Helen Caldicott, who gave him a stern lecture about the dangers of nuclear weapons. But they say that movie, The Day After, if people haven't seen that, at least just go look up on YouTube the opening scenes from The Day After. This is an ABC miniseries from 1983, and we all watched it at school. I was in third grade in elementary school at the time, or second grade, and we all watched it, and it shows pretty good, Return of the Jedi era special effects of this is what it would look like to have H-bombs going off over Kansas City, and what it would be like for the American Midwest to be destroyed by Soviet thermonuclear bombs. And Ronald Reagan saw that and went, oh my God. And then he decided from then, in fact, I think he already had believed this, but he decided now he was certain that he was on a mission from God, like the Blues Brothers, to abolish all nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. And in fact, and we're not talking about Walter Mondale here again, we're talking about Ronald Reagan. And he almost made a deal at Reykjavik, Iceland in 1986. And this is 3 years, before the wall comes down. 3 years before the wall comes down, 5 years before the unraveling of the Soviet Union. And Ronald Reagan came a hair away from making a deal to abolish all nukes with the Soviet Union. At that time, they had 40 and we had 30,000. And the only reason that the deal was ruined was because over the Soviet insistence that they scrap their anti-ballistic missile systems. And Reagan wanted to build the Star Wars program. And Reagan said, well, I promised the American people. And Richard Pearl, the neoconservative, so-called Prince of Darkness, self-proclaimed Prince of Darkness, and his friends at Defense, and the neoconservatives like Norman Podhoretz at Commentary Magazine and all these guys really put the screws to him and said that this was the greatest betrayal of the American people. And he said, well, I did promise the American people I'd build them this missile shield, not understanding that, man, this is a ridiculous fantasy. America in the 1980s, we're going to have the technology to shoot down incoming ICBMs with lasers in space and all this crap. Get out of here, man. It's total fantasy. And then also, if we're dismantling all the ICBMs, then what do you need a missile shield for, dude? Come on here. And that was what killed it, was something that couldn't have killed it. And it wasn't some utopian magic wish either. The plan was, and they would get American and Soviet arsenals down to the levels of our peers. So Britain and France and Israel at that time all had about 200 each to 300 each. And China as well had about 200 to 300 nuclear bombs. So we'd get American Soviet arsenals down to the equal levels with them. And then we would host new conferences, and it'd be America and the Soviet Union leaning on our allies that actually France and Britain and Israel, you agree with us that now we're going to sign this treaty and get down to 100 each. And the Soviet Union would lean on China. We're going to get down to 100 each. And then we're going to see if we can get down to 50. And then we're going to see if we can get down to 25. Right. So that was the plan. It wasn't, oh, yeah, Jesus is going to come back and make everybody feel high. No, it was a deliberate and systematic plan to dismantle the nukes. And it was only foiled by, in other words, it was a reasonable proposal to abolish H-bombs from the face of the earth that was thwarted by a ridiculous fantasy of an anti-ballistic missile defense system that was completely unworkable, certainly at the time. And even now, they have to rig all the tests to shoot down Mach 18 ICBMs coming in from outer space. You know, the only real, as Gordon Prather taught me, the only real anti-ballistic missile defense is using nukes, firing anti-nuclear missiles into space to try to knock out the enemy's nukes coming in from space. And that's what the neutron bomb is for. That's what the neutron bomb is. They said it was for killing every Russian with radiation, but leaving all their industry behind or whatever. That wasn't what it was. It was an enhanced radiation device. Essentially, they use a thinner shell on the bomb so that more of the energy is released in the form of gamma rays instead of heat. And in that way, they use that radiation to knock out the avionics and destroy the electronics and et cetera in the warheads in space. That is the point of those. And Gordon Prather goes, look, you want to knock out an incoming ICBM attack from Russia, you're going to need H-bombs You're going to need to shoot and launch H-bombs into space and set off H-bombs over your own country, basically, to try to knock out their missiles from getting to a low enough altitude over your cities to really destroy them. And so otherwise, the whole thing's a fantasy anyway. Lasers and Sparrow missiles and whatever. You can shoot down a Scud with a Patriot. You can't shoot down a Mach 18 ICBM coming in from space, you know?
All right, let me ask you, when in your book, you start with Bush 41, and again, I mean, I've seen you in other books and in many interviews. You get back into Jimmy Carter and some of his mistakes, and you go back into the 70s and then forward. But in your book, I got the feeling, not the feeling, I guess it was just the read I have on your analysis. Clinton turns out to be a pretty bad guy when it comes to handling of post-Soviet fall. It seems like you have the most incredible opportunity to really solidify potential world peace. And there's this expansion of NATO playing footsie in Europe with all of these countries under this, it's not really NATO anymore. Then you talk about in some circumstances where like NATO simply needed something to do. And I remember this fallout the other year when Trump says, NATO, why didn't that end with the end of the Soviet Union? Wasn't that what it was founded for? And I saw Tucker Carlson, of course, famously came out and said he said something to one of his CIA grew up in the neighborhood buddies in the DC suburbs. And it was like, shut up, you can't say that. So there was clearly a mood within Washington, D.C. You'd never question NATO. You didn't question its origins, and you certainly didn't question its continued formation or what its objectives appeared to be. But it was a legitimate question. So I ask you this. What is it about Clinton that he didn't see this, what I think you outlined very clearly was an opportunity in the early 90s? Of course, he goes in January of 1993. He's coming on the heels of Bush 41. But there seemed to be this clear opportunity to really solidify world peace. You get into, he sent his Ivy League boys, the Harvard types in there to do the economics, and instead of free market, really, the Austrian school guys, and it would have definitely maybe turned out differently. But what is it about Clinton? Is he just a screw up, or is there some ideological bent there? What do you think the thing was with Clinton that he didn't do a better job with it?
Well, he's a terrible person. Right. Like on a personal level, he's a face-biting rapist, child-killing, lying, murdering, SOB. If you believe in the afterlife, he's going to burn in hell forever and ever, tortured by Satan himself for all of his sins. So that's the kind of person that he is. So then, yeah, it's no surprise that he made nothing but bad decisions, right? Is a horrible
guy. Was it
guy.
For financial gain? I mean, did he make...
Well... Okay, so like a big part of it on NATO expansion, all his advisors knew better to do this. But remember, we talked about Bruce Jackson and Lockheed. Well, they sponsored the Committee on NATO Expansion. And they had, a huge move to lobby the Eastern European countries and get them to petition to join NATO. And in order to get Lockheed products at American taxpayer, expense for their militaries and this kind of thing. So it was a huge push. In the election in 1996, Bill Clinton knew he needed Lockheed dollars and he needed Polish votes. And so you had, a large Polish American populations in Illinois and in Pennsylvania. And I think
Pennsylvania, definitely.
Pennsylvania as well. And so you need those electoral college votes.
Yeah.
And their local lobbies had been, they were all working together. They were, the people the vested interests here, they were going after prominent Polish American businessmen and saying, hey, man, get on board with this. You know what I mean? They were working hard to build up that consensus as part of their electoral strategy. So this is what, and I really need to study this. I keep saying that and I keep not doing it. I really need to study more about this, but there's a section of libertarian political economy studies called public choice theory, which essentially is a wonky way of saying there's no such thing as public choices. There are the private choices of the people in charge. So you and I sitting here hashing these things out over the camera, trying to figure out, well, what's in America's national interest here? What's the best thing to do for the future of our country over the short, medium, and long term here as best as we can divine? They look at it differently.
Right.
They look at it like, how do I get reelected right now?
Yeah.
Because what's the point of doing anything if I'm fired and it's somebody else's decisions to make after I'm gone, right? And so that's how, it's the economics of politics, as Obi-Wan Kenobi instructs us, right? So in fact, literally, he explains to Anakin, the members of the Senate are only interested in the interests of those who finance their campaigns.
Right.
That's exactly how it works. That's the military industrial congressional complex, right? And as you said, his aides made him take that out because it sounded like he was kind of trying to lord the executive branch over the legislative branch when he didn't believe in that. There's a reason that Article 1 is Article 1 and the presidency is only Article 2 here, So he wasn't he wanted to kind of ease off that connotation, but that was what he was worried about, was that it'll be the firms making the weapons decide who your congressman is. And then those congressmen will all decide that the weapons makers get whatever they want, because of course they will. That's how it works. And so that was why he was saying in there that the American public at large must guard against this influence, because it is built in. It's guaranteed. This is how it works. As long as we have these armament industries, they will remain self-interested and they will remain on the move. And so it'll be your job to essentially try to roll them back,
Eisenhower comes out pretty good, I think, when you really study him for whatever his influences were. Of course, among your Ivy League educated super historians, you don't really hear his name brought up very much. But, the 8 years he's president, I don't think there was any major loss of nations to communism. He did a pretty good job of the whole containment. And, he got in during Korea, ended that, or at least ended it with the truce and went right back to the same parallel and all of that. But pretty good time for the economy, right? Country did a pretty good job, it seemed like, in the 50s, and he's sort of an afterthought. But looking back, saying what he said in that farewell address was pretty ballsy.
I mean, the thing is, too, I don't know what would have happened. I think that there's a compelling narrative that he was determined to end the Cold War.
Yeah.
And what happened was, and I really don't know how deliberate this was and who all called the shots. I'm sure there are books and books about this.
Right.
But he had a scheduled summit with Nikita Khrushchev.
And then the power shot down.
And then Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union.
That's right.
And supposedly he had given explicit orders to the CIA to stop all these overflights.
Yep.
The pilot was not supposed to even have a parachute because it was supposed to be a completely top secret mission.
That's right.
He, was shot down. Either they flew him at a deliberately low altitude to get him shot down, which is not unthinkable. We saw in the Downing Street memo, that was a plan to try to get a U-2 shot down over Iraq as an excuse to start Iraq War II, a rolling start, they called it. So yeah, that's in print. You can read it yourself.
Well, Gulf of Tonkin is clearly bullshit, and that, what that did for Vietnam. So it's not like it's not in the history.
In this case, I mean, the question is whether the CIA sabotaged President Eisenhower's summit in order to keep the Cold War going. And so I think there's a very good chance of that. Now, there's another statement of his where he said, God help the next president or any other president who doesn't know the army as well as I do and doesn't have the influence that I have. Well, as you said, he was a 5-star general, commander of all United Nations forces in Europe in the Second World War.
That's right.
It was everything that he could do to try to keep the reins on the army, who were constantly demanding 10 more divisions, 20 more, 30 more. And he's saying, no, I'm giving all your money to the Air Force. We're making nuclear bombs, not army divisions. So you guys shut up and back off. But it was everything that he could do and he had to build more nukes. That was his new look policy. He had to build more nukes to get the army to just stop, because they're so self-interested. They're just relentless. They're the empire itself, and they wouldn't stop. And so then, as you know more about this than me, but then the common theory is, and the next president, they shot him in the head.
Well, and I was going to say something, something about Kennedy too. I remember reading, and just the human dynamic of this. Kennedy's 43 at the time of his inauguration. He's a lieutenant junior grade. He's on a PT boat with 13 personnel. He's an O2. When he goes to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his first meeting, he's sitting among a bunch of 4-stars, many of them World War II heroes, and he's an ensign, or lieutenant junior grade. He's an O2. So an historian I read said, when Eisenhower sat down at the table, Nobody had a bigger one. I mean, nobody was in there like, Ike, I'm sorry, how many stars? I had 5. I had 5 of them. So, there was a dynamic there, certainly because of that. Eisenhower had served at that level. And I do think Kennedy was pushed around. There's no doubt about it. But It's interesting that you're saying with Eisenhower's 5 stars in his experience, it was that much of a battle for him to reign in the powers.
Right. Yeah. Now, he said, God help future presidents who don't know the Army the way I do.
Exactly.
Well, no president in any coming future knows the Army as well as you do.
That's right.
There's nobody coming. H.W. Bush, he was in World War II, but he was a captain or whatever. He was an officer, but he was no 5-star, Yeah,
he was shot down as an 18-year-old. He was the youngest naval pilot, Bush 41, during World War II. And I think that kind of ended his, God bless him for that. Well, there's a lot of other things to not God bless him about, I'm sure. But as far as his service went, I think it was in and out pretty quick because he was an 18-year-old and he got shot down fairly quickly into the war. But he did have that experience.
Wasn't in the war, was he? I don't think
he was in uniform. Johnson were in uniform, Navy. Bobby Kennedy wore a uniform for 15 minutes. It was kind of this is actually an interesting thing. You can watch the 1960 presidential election returns. When I was teaching in college a few years ago, I would bring this up to students for whatever purpose. But when you look at Huntley Brinkley, 1960, the black and white film, Huntley at one point says, let me tell you about the M1A1 standard issue running for the U.S. Congress for the House this year. I'll ask you, in 1960, what percent of candidates for the House do you believe had served in the military in 1960?
Oh, I'm sure it's a super majority, right?
96.
Oh, wow.
So when I would say that to Claire, I'm like, what? I said, no. Imagine running in 1960, which would probably put you, if you'd served in the military, somewhere in that early 40s to mid 40s range. Imagine in 1960, you're in a congressional district in your hometown, America, whatever, fill in the blank town, and you didn't serve in either Korea or World War II. How the hell could you run for public office? Now you fast forward, they're the very same people in the Congress that are sending everybody else's kid into Vietnam, X number of years later, within a decade, they're sending kids to Vietnam. They are the veterans of that war, or 2 wars, Korea and World War II. So one other thing I'll say about Eisenhower, that same friend of mine that I mentioned earlier, that was a Vietnam veteran. I came in one day to do radio with him, and I said, it's interesting. Last night I was watching, and CBS had played the 20 years after D-Day Eisenhower Cronkite black and white film. They're in a Jeep. They're riding the beaches of Normandy. So it's 1964. Eisenhower's like 5 years from his death. And they go to the room where they had the big map still on the wall, and Eisenhower's talking about the landing, and the weather guy said, don't go on June 5th. It's going to be a monsoon, and it was. And then June 6th was their only window. And he's telling intensely the story of all the pressure on him to do this Normandy invasion. And then as he talks about the tens of thousands of soldiers that would be wounded and killed, he gets a little catch in his throat. And I come in the next day and I'm telling my buddy, I said, that's the guy I want to be president. That guy. Because he didn't say that. And when I think back to following presidents who sent all these troops to their death, they're sending, I always think about Ed and Marge in Topeka, Kansas, that are losing their precious baby boy in some war that we have no business there. That pisses me off, brother, that people send kids into harm's way to get their limbs blown off, and they don't give 2 shits about these kids.
Oh, they don't at all.
At all. And then I think, I'm looking at Eisenhower. This is an older man now. He's been a 5-star general. He's been that supreme commander of Allied forces. He's in a Jeep with Walter Cronkite 20 years post D-Day, and he still gets emotional talking about what he knew was going to happen, and that was American troops are going to die.
Yeah, well, Barbara Bush, H.W. Bush's wife, she spoke for all of Washington, D.C. when she said, I don't want to hear all this about casualties. That's not relevant. God. So why would I waste my beautiful mind on something like that? Right? That's what your sons are to the Bushes.
Yeah.
Not human. They're goyim, right? They're N-words. They're gooks, just like the enemy.
Yeah.
Right? American boys.
Yeah.
We're just gooks, just like the people that they send us to kill.
Therein lies all the problems, right? And I think you're right, though, too. And I did want to make one other comment because I think you'll agree with me on this. I have a friend of mine. I'm a big baseball guy. I had a baseball friend in doing a show. And we had a break, and he goes, hey, what do you think about what's going on with the media? Like, I heard somebody on one of the major networks say something the other day that was so asinine crazy. And I'm like, let him say it. Well, you don't think they should be? I said, hell no, don't let them be. This is why their ratings are in the toilet, is because people are starting to figure out they lie. So now we're in the medium. You know, you can tell I love to run my mouth, and I've always had opinions on things. And a friend of mine, 6-8 months ago, like, why don't you start podcasting? Get out there, run your mouth, say things. And again, I mentioned earlier before we went on, I remember first hearing Dave Smith, and then it was Michael Malice, and then it was Tom Woods. And I had Tom Woods' politically incorrect history from years ago. But I'm listening to all these fellow brothers in the same mindset. And I think we're taking over. I say we. You're in a much larger position in this than I am. But I just think it's gotten to the point when I grew up, and again, I got 15 years on you roughly. It was ABC, CBS, NBC, and you had a UHF channel, right? That's right. And you listen to a few radio stations, a little bit of FM music, and maybe AM. You listen to some political talk. I'll tell you somebody that you have to give a lot of credit to is Rush Limbaugh. He changed the landscape of America. Sure. By revitalizing AM radio and putting a different thought, like him or not. And I think he was pretty good radio.
As you said, I'm a radio guy, man. I grew up in that era in the 1990s.
Yes.
And so, Rush Limbaugh and G. Gordon Liddy and all those guys. And, Limbaugh was the most superficial center-right Republican kind of mascot, right? He never said anything very important on there. But what he did do, though, was he opened up phone lines, and he also he just set the stage for 10,000 Rush Limbaugh clones whose show came on after him.
That's right.
In their local city.
That's
where
right.
People could participate in that thing. And, man, when I first heard AM radio, I was 16 years old. And the first time I was just driving down the road in my new car, well, my hand-me-down car from my sister, new to me, my Plymouth. And I says, oh, you know what? I've lived in Austin my whole life, and I have no idea what's on the AM radio. My dad didn't listen to AM radio. You know what I mean? Like, I remember the neighbor kid's dad listened to, like, news in the morning, but, like, that was basically it. When he would take us to school or something like that. So I'm like, I'm interested in what's on the AM band. And I tuned in. The first thing I found was a Branch Davidian being interviewed on KLBJ AM.
Wow.
In Austin. And at the time, the host was Johnny Walker, and he was just the FM good time DJ rock and roll guy.
Yeah.
And so he was so explicit that, listen, I don't know anything, and I don't think anything, and I don't have any opinions about anything. I am literally a host of this show. The guest is a surviving Branch Davidian named whichever it was, and our phone lines are open. And so he is simply facilitating, and the conversation is between a surviving Branch Davidian and the public in Austin, like participating. And I'm listening to this, and the callers all know what they're talking about. The callers are good on everything. And the callers going, see, they said this, but on March 15th, they said that, and no, and all of this, right? And so this is, to me, like, you couldn't have made this up. This is magical. This is
the public square,
the town square,
right?
Everybody gets to have one big conversation at the same time, and the guy who whoops the most ass rises to the top. And,
that's right.
This is how it's supposed to be, and this is what we've really lost, unfortunately, with all the silo effect of the media, where, unfortunately, we have a few top podcasters that have a broader reach. But in so many ways, people are very isolated into smaller and smaller echo chambers where they're only kind of hearing their own sort of news. That's why a lot of liberal Democrats still believe that Russiagate was real, because they never got exposed to anyone telling them that, no, man, it really wasn't. And here's where you can read about that or whatever. You know what I mean? They're isolated away. But then, we do have a few of the biggest ones who, you mentioned Dave Smith. He was just on Joe Rogan again the other day and just batting 1,000, just knocking it out of the park on.
He's beautiful,
Iran,
man.
On Israel, on Ukraine, on everything, and on the state, on the role of America in the world. And so that's just so many people.
And God bless Joe Rogan too, because he's the guy. And I think about that with this show, and bringing you on today. Just anybody I bring on, I do want some of that, like, we just met at a bar, and we were having a beer, and I'm like, so, hey, what do you do, brother? And you kind of have that conversation. I think that Rogan clearly, especially post his COVID experience, his eyes were opened. But Rogan always struck me as a dude you'd want to hang out with in the bar, have a beer, talk stuff with, because he just does guy stuff. And I think he's intellectually curious. and I think he's been politicized to a certain degree because especially the attack on him about his medications and, what a particular network did as far as his image online. And yep. I think it woke him up to a lot of like, wait a minute, these people are actually bullshit artists. And this is not as true as I thought it was. But yeah, he's meant a lot. And the fact that he's getting the kind of coverage he's getting and the fact that these major networks are getting 127,000 people for a show, it's like, and I will say though this too, I don't know what's going to happen next. When I was teaching in college a few years ago, like Prince died. And I said, hey guys, it's tragic. Prince just died. And they're like, who the hell is Prince? And I'm like, wow. And I'm like, man, but I told him, I said, there was a time my mother may not have approved of Madonna, but my mother was aware of Madonna. And I said, there was Elvis, there was the Beatles, there was the Ed Sullivan Show. There was every comedian had to go through Johnny Carson. And we had a common culture. When we went to the water cooler on Monday morning, we were all talking about the same things we saw in our limited sources of entertainment. That's all gone now. We had 3 newspapers maybe in the town, 2 maybe, and all that's changed. So I don't think that young people clearly they're not getting it from the same sources. They're getting some information from somewhere. Some of it probably tragically dangerous, but at the same time, where I'm going with this is I wonder how much we're winning. Like what you and I...
We're making real progress. Look, we don't have the power, but we are absolutely winning the argument in the country. And as Douglas McGregor says, time wins more arguments than reason.
Yeah.
So, it's good that we've been right about this all along and saying the same thing all along, just like with Ron Paul. You can double check. Was he really good on this back when it counted? Yeah, he was.
Yeah, he was.
But is it my arguments that have really won people over? Or it's just the fact that they're looking at a calendar and they're looking back at the last 25 years and they're going, geez, that guy really is right. We haven't gotten nothing out of this.
Right.
Now, I can go all in depth of what all it's cost us, but they know that it's cost us a lot. And they know that we have literally nothing to show for it that we can brag about whatsoever, that we can boast of a single success, as David Petraeus would call it, because he wouldn't dare use the V word, victory. But we haven't had the slightest success. We haven't done a thing other than Obama worked with Netanyahu to create the Islamic State Caliphate because they hate the Shiites more. That sound like an accomplishment to you, right? And so everybody is just absolutely fed up with this. And then, the other thing about it is just 3 and 4G phone technology, man, is just changing the game in a way where we didn't have in Iraq or even in the war in Syria 15 years ago through 10 years ago in, Obama's dirty war in Syria. Here in what we have in Palestine, even with Israel killing as many journalists as they can on a virtually daily basis over there, and murdering their entire families deliberately too, that there's still enough people with cell phones in Palestine who can show pictures of what it's like to be there. And it has turned the official overall American public opinion now favors the Palestinians over the Israelis, despite, 100, maybe 900 trillion times as much propaganda for the Israeli side in American media. But we can just see with our own eyes that, no, actually the Israelis are barbarians. And we can hear them talking about how they are the master race and everyone else has to die because God chose them. And so they can do whatever they want. They have supernatural property rights that override everyone else's right to ownership and even to their own life. And it's absolutely sickening and disgraceful. They're a mirror image of the National Socialists that persecuted their fathers and grandfathers in the Second World War. And it's absolutely disgusting. And no amount of Hasbara propaganda can change that. And so right now, my friend, among Republican voters, it's 50-50.
Right.
Okay. Among Republican voters, and I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but let's just say it used to be 90-10 in favor of the Israelis. Okay. Something approximating that. And now people can just see you're not victims, you're perpetrators, right? Adolf Hitler pretended that the Poles attacked him too. And, October 7th did happen, but compared to what the Israelis have done in response, they've washed all that away. That doesn't mean anything. They've killed 100,000 innocent people. They deliberately buried children alive. Have you ever known any 4 or 5-year-olds? Imagine a 4-year-old you've ever known or cared for buried alive in a void space in an apartment where now, their leg is crushed, they're pinned in there, and now they're going to die of thirst and starvation over the next 5 days because no one can get to them. That's what the Israelis do to little children in Palestine constantly. They bomb tents. They bomb journalists. Journalists leave the house and then they bomb their house and kill their wife and children. Right? They are Nazis. They are National Socialist barbarians. And everyone hates them now. And they've done it to themselves. And now you have to understand, one, this represents a great victory for this decentralized media that you're talking about, where the truth wins out. But also in this specific case, you have to remember that the Israeli regime thrives off of anti-Semitism. And so, and even anti-Israeli and anti-Zionist opinion, because they conflate that with anti-Semitism, because their greatest propaganda is to tell Jews around the world that everybody hates you for being Jewish. And that's why you ought to leave where you are and come here. And so when they criticize the Israeli state for, grinding little kids' bones to make their bread, that, oh no, what they're really saying is they just hate Jews and they hate you and they're going to kill you. And so you ought to flee where you are and come and move to Israel, where you can be real safe there. And which is insane, but that's their propaganda and they use it all the time. So they want American and other Jews around the world to be afraid of anti-Semitism. So they don't care, right? When their absolute cruelty in Gaza has the negative consequence of spreading anti-Israeli and even anti-Jewish sentiment in the world, they like that. That's a positive side effect of their barbarianism, is that it drives people against, again, they define all anti-Zionist sentiment as anti-Jewish sentiment, right? And then they tell their people, see, everyone hates us. Everyone's out to get us. Only the national government of Israel can save you now, which of course they believe.
Right.
Yeah.
So where does it all go, you think? I think there's two parts to what you just said. I think that there may be an awakening of Americans who have been supported of the nation of Israel or its action as a government. And I think there is a segment that, regardless of all the things that you've just stated, I think there's some people in the United States that are becoming leery of just that type of connection we have to a nation, regardless of their policies. Right. Why are we so intertwined with the inner workings of somebody else's government? I think that's concern. And I know you probably watched the Michael Massey when he was on with Tucker Carlson and talking about some of the pressures and influences of lobbyists when it comes to that. And Massey is a guy, and I may be wrong. I mean, I once believed in Santa Claus and I wanted to believe in other things that were, but man, he seems to be the right guy. He's a
decent guy.
Yeah. No, I believe he seems to really nail it. I just hope that, that the scales aren't lifted and I find that there's something else going on here, but gosh, I love the guy and I think he's right. And I don't know why there's not more congressmen like him. Just 3, if there was 5, if there were any, and that whole dynamic between him and Trump, I find quite interesting. On your way out, please make any closing remarks, how people can find you. Again, we're promoting your book, Provoked, and any other things that you would like to tell the audience.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I'm really excited to announce that very soon here, like within the next month, I'm pretty sure, we're going to be debuting the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom, which is just like Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom, only he built it for me. And it's me and a bunch of my best guys on, James Bovard, the great James Bovard, on his career of investigative journalism, Ramsey Baroud on Israel-Palestine, William Bupert on how we've lost every war since 1945, C.J. Kilmer on how Woodrow Wilson is the worst person who ever lived. And one more guy, I'm sorry, whose name I forget, who Tom recruited, who's a Lutheran college professor and scholar, who's going to be debunking this premillennialist, dispensational, Darbyite Christian Zionism for us. And so this is all to be coming up in the next few months here. And people can just go to scotthortonacademy.com and put your email address in there and you'll be the first to know when we go live. And then otherwise, I'll direct you to the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, antiwar.com. And my show is the Scott Horton Show at scotthortonshow.com. And that's my Substack. And if you subscribe, I'm going to get right back to editing and uploading the chapters of the audiobook of Provoked there. And then otherwise, just check me out on Amazon. I've written 3 books and edited 2 more.
Scott, great pleasure. Honor to have you on the show today. Please send my best to the Dave Smiths and the Tom Woods and all these guys I've been listening to for some time. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate the libertarian cause. Appreciate the fact you're getting this information out. So people that are listening to the show, more to consider. Please like, subscribe, comment, and please follow these other like-minded individuals in the libertarian cause. Believe, and I think Scott was exactly right on this, if we can get more and more people to open their eyes to what we believe is the proper function of government and or really begin to question what many people assume to be the function of government or the authority and jurisdiction that they have over us. I don't know. Sometimes I question, like, how do we get to these thoughts? How do we come to these conclusions? These are all things worth looking into. I think the libertarian view has a lot to help you with understanding your role in society vis-a-vis everyone else around you, and maybe we can come to better conclusions. God bless you, Scott. Thanks for you being on today, and I look forward to hopefully doing this again sometime soon. Thank you, brother.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. If you like the show, subscribe and hit your notification button to get an update when we post another episode. See you soon.